He found $100,000 in an alley, and no one expected what he did next. On a rainy morning in Eastwood Flats, 9-year-old Malik Johnson stumbled upon a heavy leather bag peeking from behind a dumpster. His small hands trembled as he lifted it, seeing stacks of cash that could have solved every struggle at home. But instead of keeping it, Malik carried the bag through puddles and fog toward the police station, unaware that this single act of honesty would catch the attention of a powerful woman and change his life forever. The rain fell in slow, shimmering sheets over Eastwood Flats, turning the narrow alleyways into mirrors of yellow streetlights and neon signs from the corner stores. Malik Johnson, 9 years old, hunched under the oversized hood of his threadbare jacket, on his sneakers squelching against the wet pavement as he navigated toward the old service alley behind Manny's diner. The air smelled of damp asphalt and fried onions drifting from the restaurant kitchen. His small hands clutched the strap of a worn backpack, its zipper partially broken, and something told him today would be different. That's when he saw it. A leather duffel bag, heavy and dark, tucked behind a rusted dumpster. Its brass buckles glinted faintly under the flickering lamplight. The leather looked soft but well used, and the shoulder strap had slipped halfway through one of the metal loops. Malik froze, his heart pounding in his chest. A few green edges peeked from the partially open zipper. He crouched, careful not to make a sound, scanning the alley to make sure no one was around. The alley was empty. Just him, the rain, yes, and the bag. Slowly, he eased the zipper open, just enough to see. His eyes widened. Bundles of cash, thick and neatly stacked, were packed tightly inside. Malik's hands trembled as he tried to process what he was seeing. He knew instinctively that this wasn't his money, not his to keep, not even a single dollar of it. The total sum flickered in his mind. Over $100,000. Money that could have paid for his grandfather's prescription gaps, their overdue bills, and the quiet, unspoken struggles that filled their small, cluttered apartment. He swallowed hard and pulled back, letting the zipper fall just enough to hide the contents. His chest tightened, the weight of possibility pressing down on him almost as heavily as the leather bag itself. He could walk away, turn the corner, and vanish into the drizzle, free from responsibility. Nobody would know. Nobody would care. The thought made him shiver, not from the cold, but from the gravity of the choice in front of him. Malik glanced at his reflection in a puddle, the streetlight catching his serious, small face. The rain fell onto the puddle, rippling across the stacks of cash in his mind. A voice in his head whispered what his grandfather had told him countless times. Character is what you do when nobody's watching. He thought about Mr. Earl Johnson, hunched over his oatmeal back home, his pale blue eyes steady, and his hands that could fix almost anything despite the slow creep of blindness. His grandfather depended on him every morning, every chore, every small act of care. Could he betray that trust for the sake of money? Malik straightened, gripping the duffel bag with both hands. While it was heavier than he expected, and his arms ached immediately. He tested his balance, shifting the weight across his small shoulders, and then took a careful step forward. One step. Another. The rain pelted his hood, soaked through his jacket, and the faint neon from Manny's flickered across the alley bricks. He breathed steadily, forcing himself to focus on the rhythm of his steps and the wet leather strap cutting into his fingers. The city around him was oblivious. Cars slid past on the slick streets, windshield wipers slicing through the gray haze. A man on a bicycle whizzed by, calling out a greeting to a friend, oblivious to the child struggling with the duffel bag. Malik ignored them all. One block at a time he moved. The weight pressed against his arms, his back, his small frame, but he did not falter. Yet every thought in his mind was of one thing: bringing the bag to the right place where it belonged. His legs burned as he made his way toward Detroit Precinct Number 7, a building he had passed dozens of times on walks home from school. The glowing blue police lights, even turned off, seemed to shimmer through the rainy haze, guiding him. He entered through the non-emergency doors, hands slick on the bag strap, and stepped into the warmth and hum of fluorescent light. The front desk officer looked up, startled by the sight. A small boy, drenched from rain, straining under the weight of a large leather duffel. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cautious but professional. Malik nodded, placing the bag carefully on the counter. "I found this," he said quietly, almost as if speaking too loudly would break the spell. "There's money inside. I think it belongs to someone." The officer's eyebrows lifted, and she glanced toward the side office before returning her attention to him. "Did you take any of it?" she asked gently. Malik shook his head. "No, ma'am. It isn't mine. I wanted to bring it here." The room felt still for a heartbeat, only the low hum of the overhead fluorescent lights filling the space. He stood there, soaked, exhausted, and resolute, the duffel bag heavy in his small hands, knowing that this decision, this single act of integrity, might not just define his day, but perhaps change the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the rain continued to fall over Eastwood Flats, the alley now empty, save for the faint reflection of streetlights in the puddles. Inside the precinct, Malik's gaze met the officer's, who calm, unwavering, carrying the quiet dignity of a boy who had already done the right thing, even when no one was watching. The question lingered in the air. Would anyone recognize the courage behind this small, determined act, and what would happen when the owner of the bag finally arrived? Malik didn't know. All he knew was that he had chosen to be the person he actually was, and nothing else mattered right now. Malik shook the last of the rain from his hood as he stepped back onto the slick sidewalk, leaving the precinct behind. The neon glow of the corner store reflected on puddles, making the wet asphalt shimmer like tiny, distorted mirrors. His arms still ached from carrying the heavy leather bag, but the ache was tempered by a strange, quiet pride that settled in his chest. It wasn't about the money. Oh, not really. It was about doing the right thing. And for the first time that day, he felt the weight of his choices rather than the weight of the duffel. He turned the corner toward Deacon Street, his neighborhood, passing familiar storefronts with their morning signs barely visible through the mist. The sound of early traffic hummed along the main avenues, muffled by the fog, but in the smaller streets, only the occasional car splashing through a puddle broke the silence. Malik's mind wandered briefly to his grandfather, Earl Johnson, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for him to come home with breakfast and the morning pills laid out in their precise spots. He pictured the old man's pale, clouded eyes, his gnarled hands wrapped around the mug of coffee Earl always insisted on having ready, even blind, but his grandfather could sense the small changes in the world around him. And today, Malik knew, he would sense that something different had happened. The walk home was long, nearly 20 minutes, but Malik moved steadily, balancing the duffel over one shoulder, the other hand tucked in the pocket of his threadbare jacket. Occasionally, he stopped to rest, squatting on the curb for a moment, letting his small shoulders shake as he took in ragged breaths. Each time he did, he noticed the subtle life of the street. The old man sweeping in front of his corner store, the dog tethered to the lamppost barking at a delivery truck, the flicker of light in the windows of apartments above shops where families were beginning their day. To anyone else, it was ordinary. To Malik, it was the backdrop of a life that had taught him to see the small, steady truths in the world. When he arrived at the narrow brownstone where he lived with Earl, Malik paused at the stoop, fumbling with the keys. His fingers were numb from the cold, and the damp jacket clung to him. But he managed the lock with careful precision. The door creaked open, and the familiar warmth of their kitchen hit him immediately. A mix of Earl's brewing coffee, the faint scent of cornbread cooling on the counter, and the soft tang of tomato sauce from last night's dinner. The apartment was modest, but immaculately kept. Every jar and can on the shelves had been labeled with raised tape, a system Earl relied on to navigate his blindness. "Grandpa?" Malik called softly as he set the duffel down on the floor near the counter. Earl's voice answered, calm but alert. "You back, son?" Malik nodded, wiping the wet hair from his forehead. "Yes, sir. I've been—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Doing the right thing." Earl's hands, gnarled and strong, lifted from the mug he held to rest gently on Malik's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that whatever had happened, he trusted his grandson. The old man's blue eyes, pale and clouded, seemed to pierce through the room despite the darkness behind them. He didn't need to see the bag to understand the story it carried. "You brought it where it belonged?" he asked. Malik nodded, climbing onto the small stool at the counter, brushing crumbs from the worn tabletop. "I did. Every bit of it. It wasn't mine to take." Earl exhaled slowly, a sound that seemed to carry both relief and a quiet admiration. "That boy of mine," he murmured to himself, as though Malik caught the faint grin in the tone. "Integrity," he added, almost as if saying it to the walls themselves. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic slipping through the fog. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the moral weight carried by a small boy on a damp Thursday morning. Malik began laying out Earl's morning pills in the tiny dish beside the sink, counting carefully, aligning them with the slice of bread he toasted for his grandfather's breakfast. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, a choreography born of years of responsibility far beyond his age. Today, though, each gesture felt heavier with meaning. Not just because of the duffel bag, but because he had taken a stand. He had proven to himself that doing what was right mattered more than convenience, more than survival, more than anything money could buy. After breakfast, Malik helped Earl settle into his chair by the window, adjusting the light so it wouldn't glare in his eyes, reading aloud the day's newspaper with a calm, measured voice. The articles about city politics and sports results barely registered. The rhythm of shared words and presence was what truly mattered. Outside, fog clung stubbornly to the streets, and the alley where the leather bag had waited for hours felt like a distant memory, already fading into the background of the day. A soft knock at the door startled Malik. He wiped his hands on his jacket and opened it to find Mrs. Grayson, their neighbor, standing with a small, warm smile. I'm here to drive you and your grandpa somewhere," she said, nodding toward Malik. His chest tightened. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, keeping his voice steady, the duffel bag set carefully behind the counter, a silent promise that it would not leave the apartment until its proper owner arrived. As they walked out into the misty street, Malik's mind wandered to the weight of what had just happened. He had made a choice, a moral decision, and the world had not yet responded. Would someone notice? Would it matter at all? The fog swirled around them, muffling the sounds of the city, and in that gray, liquid silence, Malik realized something profound. It wasn't about recognition. It was about who he was when nobody was watching. And today, for the first time in a long while, he had been exactly that person. And the streets of Eastwood Flats stretched ahead, wet and shining, lined with brick row houses, old street lamps, and corner shops just opening for the day. Each step Malik took toward the police station was measured, deliberate, a rhythm he had learned from mornings spent guiding his grandfather, preparing meals, and sorting the small, exacting details of their modest life. The duffel bag sagged with weight, yet it seemed lighter in his arms now, the burden lessened by the resolve he carried in his chest. As the precinct came into view, its brick facade dull under the persistent drizzle. Malik's stomach fluttered with a mix of fear and determination. He had no idea who would be behind the counter, no clue what they would think, but he knew this. He could not let the money remain unclaimed. It did not belong to him, and he had carried it through puddles, over cracked sidewalks, and past strangers who barely glanced at him. Each step had been a testament to the quiet, steadfast morality instilled in him by his grandfather. Pushing open the precinct doors, Malik was greeted by the low murmur of morning activity and the harsh fluorescent light above. His sneakers squeaked softly against the linoleum floor, drawing the attention of the officer at the front desk. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the small boy, soaked to the skin, straining under the weight of the bag that could easily have crushed him if mishandled. Malik placed it carefully on the counter, setting it down like a fragile treasure. I found this, he said, voice steady despite the adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. There's money inside. I think it belongs to someone. The officer leaned in, studying him for a long moment. He met her gaze calmly, unwavering, a small figure of integrity standing amid the hum of bureaucracy. The alley, the rain, the flickering street lamps, all of it faded behind the certainty in Malik's stance. The question hung silently. Would anyone understand the courage and character behind this small boy's actions, and how far-reaching the consequences might be? Malik didn't yet know. He only knew that he had chosen, without hesitation, to be the person he actually was, and that alone made all the difference. Malik shifted slightly, letting the weight of the duffel rest more comfortably on the counter, though every muscle in his arms and back was screaming from the effort. The officer, a young woman with a tired braid and sharp, observant eyes, leaned closer, tilting her head as she studied him. "Are you sure this isn't yours? Even part of it?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm, as though testing the edges of truth against the fragile frame of the boy before her. Malik's lips pressed together in a small line, and he shook his head. "No, ma'am. It's not mine. I just wanted to make sure it gets back to whoever it belongs to." The words hung in the fluorescent-lit room, echoing faintly against the beige walls. A soft hum of the office printers, the tapping of keys, the occasional murmur from the back room all seemed to fade as the officer blinked slowly, processing the honesty before her. There was something about Malik, not just the courage it took to carry that duffel through the rain and fog, but the steadiness in his gaze, the quiet authority in his voice. Oh, that made her pause. She straightened, signaling to a colleague at the side desk, a tall man with broad shoulders named Sergeant Harlan, who ambled over, the floor creaking under his boots. Sergeant Harlan's presence carried weight, his expression perpetually unreadable, but the corner of his mouth twitched ever so slightly as he crouched to get a better view of the bag. "You carried this all the way here?" he asked, his voice low, more curious than accusatory. Malik nodded once, careful not to overcommit his balance. "Yes, sir. It was heavy. I had to stop a few times, but I wanted to bring it here." Harlan looked at the duffel, at the bundles peeking through the zipper, and back at Malik. "And you didn't take anything?" he asked, his tone holding the faintest trace of disbelief. Malik met his eyes squarely. "No, sir. Oh, I didn't take anything. It isn't mine." The officer behind the counter shifted, watching the interplay of words and body language, sensing that this was no ordinary day at the precinct. Minutes stretched as Harlan motioned to the younger officer to start counting the bundles systematically. Every crisp stack of $10,000 bands made Malik's pulse quicken, but he didn't flinch or avert his eyes. The total, $100,000, more than he could comprehend at 9 years old, lay before him in neat rows, each bill a testament to responsibility, temptation, and self-control. The number should have intimidated him, Instead, it only made him think of the morning, of his grandfather's pills lined up on the counter, of the coffee tin slowly filling with change he collected every week, of the small and deliberate life they had carved out amidst the crumbling apartments and the foggy streets of Eastwood Flats. Then came the low click of the front door opening. The office's usual monotony was shattered by the entrance of a woman whose presence seemed to tilt the air in the room. Victoria Lane, impeccably dressed in a tailored dark blazer, a single strand of pearls resting against her throat, stepped forward. Her salt and pepper hair swept back, framing a face etched with years of precise, consequential decision-making. Her gaze swept across the room, narrowing as it landed on the boy standing steadfast beside the duffel. Every instinct in Malik's body told him to shrink, to retreat behind the counter, yet he held his ground, feeling somehow the weight of his own honesty anchoring him. "I'm Victoria Lane," she said, and her voice even and controlled, yet beneath it, a subtle tremor betrayed a flicker of panic. "I've been looking for a bag. I was told something might have been turned in here." She spoke with the authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms, yet there was an edge, an unspoken urgency, because she knew the value inside the bag and the consequences if it were lost. Malik watched her carefully, noting the precise cadence of her voice, the way her shoulders held the tension she didn't let spill into her words. The officer and Harlan stepped back, giving space as Victoria approached, her eyes finally meeting Malik's. He felt a flicker of fear. This was someone powerful, someone grown, someone who could change the course of his life. And he was just a boy with soaked shoes and aching arms. Yet he did not look away. You found my bag," Victoria said, taking a cautious step closer. "And you brought it here, without touching a single dollar?" Malik's nod was slight but firm. "Yes, ma'am. It isn't mine," he said, echoing the words he had been taught long ago by Mr. Earl Johnson, his grandfather. "Character is what you do when nobody's watching." His voice carried not just honesty, but a quiet confidence, a weight far beyond his years. Victoria's eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. She crouched slightly, not in performative warmth, but in genuine consideration, studying Malik with a look that tried to unravel the integrity of the small boy standing before her. The duffel bag, the stacks of cash, the rain-slicked streets outside, they all faded into the background. What remained was the clarity of this single, this extraordinary act. A child had carried a fortune through storm and fog, had not been tempted, and had delivered it to the rightful place with nothing but honesty guiding him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the precinct, the distant ring of phones, the shuffle of papers, all of it was suspended as Victoria processed the scene. The truth of Malik's courage and moral compass hung in the room like a tangible presence. She had faced numbers, contracts, and corporate crises her entire career. Yet here was a human scale of integrity that dwarfed anything she had encountered. A small boy, alone against the world's temptations, standing upright with the quiet weight of honesty. Finally, Victoria exhaled softly, a sound that seemed to let the tension in the room drain into the corners. She nodded, acknowledging Malik without words, and understanding that some truths do not need immediate applause. They simply exist and transform the space around them. Malik felt a flutter in his chest, not fear, not pride, but something close to relief, as if the universe itself had tilted slightly in recognition of his choice. The question remained, hanging over him like the fog outside. Would this moment, this singular act of honesty, ripple outward in ways he could not yet imagine? Malik didn't know. He only knew that, for the first time in a long week, the weight he carried was not just the leather duffel. It was the knowledge that he had done the right thing, and that in itself was more valuable than any sum of money. And as Victoria stepped back, her eyes never leaving him, Malik realized the first subtle truth of the day. the world could notice integrity, and even when it came from the smallest, most unexpected place. The walk home was quieter than usual, the rain having tapered to a soft drizzle that misted over the cracked sidewalks of Eastwood Flats. Malik's backpack, still heavy with schoolbooks, bumped against his side as he carried the lingering weight of the duffel now locked safely behind the precinct counter. Each step was measured, deliberate, as if he were pacing the rhythm of his own heartbeat, trying to make sense of the morning's extraordinary events. Streetlights glimmered through the lingering fog, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to shrink to the narrow alleyways and brick buildings he knew so well, the familiar smells of damp asphalt and coffee from the diner mingling in the cool morning air. So when Malik reached the stoop of the brownstone he shared with his grandfather, Earl Johnson, he paused, taking a deep breath, letting his small shoulders relax just a fraction. The front door creaked as he opened it, and the warm, muted light of their kitchen washed over him. The smell of oatmeal and toast greeted him, the slight tang of coffee curling through the air. Earl sat at the table, his pale blue eyes unfocused in the dim light but ever present, as though he could feel the weight of Malik's day without seeing it. "You back, son?" he asked, voice steady, but carrying a hint of curiosity. Malik nodded, placing his school backpack on the hook by the door and loosening his wet hood. "Yes, sir. Everything went okay." Earl set down his mug, the old joints of his hands creaking as he lifted them to rest atop one another. "Everything went okay?" he asked again, more insistently this time, as though reading the nuance in Malik's tone was the only way to gauge the truth. Malik exhaled slowly, climbing onto his stool, and began to recount the events at the precinct, the duffel, the cash, and the officers' reactions, careful to maintain his calm, steady voice. Each word seemed to hang in the air between them, the kitchen quiet, except for the soft tick of the wall clock and the muted hum of the refrigerator. Earl's hands flexed slightly, his knuckles white against the mug, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips, the kind that only appeared when pride and admiration silently intersected. After breakfast, Malik moved with practiced precision, setting out Earl's medications, was double-checking the small sandwich he would need for his pills later in the day. Every movement was deliberate, meticulous, and infused with the responsibility he had carried for years. Today, however, each gesture felt weighted with more than routine. It was a subtle acknowledgement of the morning's decision, a silent recognition that integrity could ripple beyond the small confines of their apartment. Outside, the misty morning enveloped the city, but inside, the warmth of their kitchen and the quiet understanding between grandfather and grandson created a world apart, one where the morality of a 9-year-old boy held its own gravity. By the time Malik prepared to leave for school, the duffel bag had become a distant memory, replaced by the tangible reality of his daily responsibilities. Yet, found the lingering awareness of having done the right thing, of resisting the temptation to claim something that was not his, infused him with a new sense of certainty and calm. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, glanced toward the window where the fog shrouded the streets, and stepped out into the pale glow of the morning. The city moved on around him, cars slipping through wet streets, shopkeepers arranging their displays, neighbors beginning their routines. But Malik's mind remained rooted in the quiet knowledge of his own integrity. He walked past familiar buildings and over puddle-strewn sidewalks, carrying not only his books and lunch, but also the unspoken weight of a choice that would echo far beyond that misty morning. As he crossed the main avenue toward Grover Park Elementary, Malik's thoughts wandered briefly to Victoria Lane, the woman whose eyes had lingered on him with a mixture of surprise and contemplation. He could not yet fathom what her presence meant, or how it might shape the days to come. All he knew was that the act of doing the right thing, in the silence of an empty alley, and under the indifferent gaze of a city that rarely noticed the small, careful lives of its residents, had already begun to change something inside him. His steps were steady, his mind sharp and his heart quietly triumphant. The bell at the schoolyard rang, signaling the start of the day, and Malik joined the line of children shuffling toward their classrooms. His classmates chattered around him, oblivious to the weight he carried that morning, to the rare test of character he had passed without fanfare or recognition. He slipped into the rhythm of school life, taking his seat by the window, watching droplets trace silver paths down the glass. Each movement of the city beyond, the sway of the trees in the breeze, the distant horn of a passing truck, the flicker of neon signs in puddles, reminded him that while the world might not notice, integrity itself did not go unseen. Somewhere, even if unseen by ordinary eyes, the consequence of his choice had already begun to unfold, stretching like the morning mist across streets, alleyways, and the lives that intersected in ways he could not yet imagine. By the time the last bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, the clouds had begun to break, letting a thin stream of afternoon light spill over the worn brick sidewalks of Eastwood Flats. Malik gathered his belongings slowly, savoring the quiet satisfaction that lingered from the morning's extraordinary decision. Outside, the park across the street shimmered with puddles reflecting the lingering drizzle, and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and exhaust from passing cars. He hugged his books to his chest, adjusting the worn straps of his backpack, and set off on the longer, winding route home that would take him past the back alleys behind local businesses, the same path that had led him to the leather duffel that morning. As he walked, Malik noticed the familiar details of his neighborhood with new clarity. The rusted fire escape on the corner apartment glinted faintly in the light, and the cracked sign of the neighborhood barbershop, once just a backdrop to his daily route, now seemed to anchor the community with its stubborn persistence. Children played in the narrow streets, their laughter echoing against the brick buildings, oblivious to the weight of choices and the lessons that sometimes went unnoticed in the ordinary passage of time. Malik's own steps were deliberate, measured, a rhythm he had internalized from years of guiding his grandfather, balancing chores, and negotiating the small responsibilities of a household that depended on him in ways most children his age could not fathom. When he reached the alley behind Manny's diner, his pace slowed. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the wet asphalt, and he remembered the leather bag tucked just behind the dumpster, the weight of temptation and the quiet hum of morality that had pressed against him with every step. He paused, letting his eyes drift over the familiar dumpster and the brick wall, and a subtle warmth rose in his chest. He had carried himself through that test and emerged untainted, not for recognition or reward, but because the act itself had demanded his full attention and honesty. Even now, the memory of the heavy leather, the slick weight in his hands, and the chill in the alley seemed to reinforce a part of him that felt deeper, steadier, more grounded. Crossing the street toward his apartment, Malik noticed Mrs. Grayson sweeping in front of her modest row house, her broom moving in steady arcs, oblivious to the small drama that had unfolded in the alley behind the diner earlier that morning. She glanced up and offered a brief nod, and Malik nodded back, a silent acknowledgement between neighbors who shared the same worn streets and unspoken routines. The day had stretched forward since the duffel, yet nothing had felt ordinary, and everything had felt heavier with the weight of choices and integrity. Inside the apartment, the smell of Earl's coffee brewed to perfection greeted him as he opened the door. The soft morning light filtered through the curtained windows, illuminating the tiny kitchen, highlighting the neat rows of labeled jars, and the little dish with that morning's pills set aside with care. Earl sat in his usual chair, pale hands wrapped around his mug, listening as Malik recounted the day in careful, measured sentences. His voice carried not just the facts of carrying the bag, but the quiet pride of having chosen the harder, morally correct path. Earl's eyes, clouded from years of progressive blindness, seemed to track Malik as though they could see every intention behind the words, You did the right thing," Earl said softly, his voice carrying both relief and admiration. Malik's chest swelled slightly at the acknowledgement, but he shook his head, redirecting attention to the dishes and preparing a simple lunch. Integrity was not a trophy, he had learned. It was a quiet, steady current that guided his actions regardless of notice or applause. After lunch, Malik prepared for his afternoon routine, checking the mailbox, gathering cans from nearby collection points, and running small errands that supported his grandfather's needs. Each motion was practiced, almost ceremonial, reflecting years of responsibility layered onto the shoulders of a child who had grown quickly in the shadow of necessity. Yet, today, each step felt lighter, imbued with the knowledge that a single act of honesty had been witnessed, and that the world, even in its sprawling indifference, sometimes aligned with the quiet truths of character. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind clouds lingering over Eastwood Flats, Malik found himself pausing at the edge of the park, watching children kick worn soccer balls across the mud-slick grass. He thought of the duffel bag, still locked safely at the precinct, and of the woman whose presence had unsettled yet intrigued him earlier. Victoria Lane, a figure of wealth and authority, had seen him in the act of honesty, and Malik could not yet predict the ways in which her observation might unfold. But he did not fear it. He had made his choice, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that the foundations of his life, small, deliberate, honest, were starting to ripple beyond the narrow streets he had always known. Thus, as he finally turned the corner toward Deacon Street, the familiar brick stoop of his brownstone rose before him. The street smelled of damp mulch and the faint aroma of late-blooming flowers from a neighbor's window box. The alley behind Manny's diner receded behind him like a shadow of the day's lessons. But the certainty of what he had done, the quiet act of carrying the duffel with honesty and delivering it to the right place, remained vivid, unyielding. Malik climbed the steps, pushed open the door, and felt the warmth of his home envelop him. The day had begun as ordinary as any other, yet the choices he had made had set a ripple in motion, one that would stretch far beyond Eastwood Flats, touching people he had not yet met, and shaping a future he had only begun to imagine. Malik set his backpack down by the door, shaking off the last remnants of rain, and stepped into the small kitchen. The morning sunlight had faded to a soft, golden hue through the thin curtains, casting elongated shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Earl Johnson, his grandfather, sat at the table with his hands wrapped around the coffee mug, eyes clouded but attentive, as if he could sense every detail of the day without needing sight. The faint aroma of oatmeal lingered, and the soft hum of the old refrigerator provided a comforting rhythm. Malik's movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as he set the lunch Earl would need later in a neat row and lined up the pills in their tiny dish, each separated by the time of day. The room smelled of home, warm, lived in, as the faint tang of coffee mingling with the earthy scent of rain still clinging to the walls from the open windows. Earl's voice broke the quiet. "You did good today, son?" he asked, calm but deliberate, each word weighed with experience and concern. Malik swallowed, taking a moment before responding. "I did what I thought was right," he said, the words steady, unembellished. The small confession carried more weight than any cheer or reward. It was a statement of his inner compass, a reflection of lessons learned through years of quiet responsibility. Earl nodded slowly, his hands flexing around the mug. He had watched Malik grow, seen him navigate the tiny household with diligence and care, and now this act in the rain, was another marker on the boy's steady, unspoken moral arc. After ensuring Earl had settled comfortably in his chair, Malik moved to the tiny window above the sink, squinting out at the street below. The puddles reflected the dim light from early evening street lamps, creating a mirror of the gray sky. Children played in the distance, kicking old soccer balls across the grass of the local park, their laughter faint and distorted through the damp air. Malik's thoughts returned to the duffel bag, still at the precinct, and the brief encounter with Victoria Lane. Her eyes, sharp and evaluating, had lingered on him longer than he expected, capturing a moment that would soon ripple far beyond his understanding. Dinner approached in its slow, measured way. Malik prepared a small meal for his grandfather, moving with precise, careful motions that had been honed over years. Each slice of bread, and each spoonful of oatmeal, each cup of water was deliberate, performed with the intention of not just feeding, but maintaining dignity. When Earl sipped his tea, Malik observed the subtle way his grandfather's shoulders relaxed, the tilt of his head, the slight exhalation that marked comfort. There was a quiet pride in knowing that he could provide these small acts, that the morning's choices had not gone unnoticed in the only way that truly mattered, the integrity within himself. As evening fell, the apartment was bathed in the golden glow of lamps, the outside streets shrouded in shadows, and occasional flickers from distant neon signs. Malik sat near the kitchen table, sketching in a notebook, a habit he had picked up to pass the long hours of responsibility and observation. And he outlined his plans for how he could better organize the apartment, streamline chores, and even assist neighbors in ways small and meaningful. Each line he drew was careful, purposeful, a reflection of the discipline that the day's events had reinforced. Outside, the hum of the city continued, cars sliding over wet streets, faint voices calling from stoops, the world moving on, unaware of the boy in the small kitchen, whose choices had already begun to echo in ways he could not yet grasp. Later, a knock at the door startled him, soft but insistent. Malik opened it to find Mrs. Grayson, their neighbor, standing in her raincoat, umbrella dripping water onto the stoop. "I came to drive you and your grandfather somewhere," she said, voice calm, the faint creak of the umbrella frame punctuating her words. Malik nodded, stepping aside and letting her see him to the door. The duffel bag, a silent emblem of his moral triumph, remained untouched at the counter, its presence more symbolic than burdensome. As they drove through the streets of Eastwood Flats, the cityscape rolled by in muted colors, the peeling paint of corner shops, cracked sidewalks, and brick buildings that had weathered decades of rain and sun. Malik sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the shifting scene, thinking of the woman, Victoria Lane, and the moment she had witnessed him act with such quiet integrity. He did not yet know what she would do with that knowledge, nor the ways in which it might shape his life in months and years to come. The hum of the car engine, the muted patter of rain on the windshield, and the familiar sights of his neighborhood combined into a cinematic tableau that framed the still, while deliberate heart of a boy whose actions, though small, carried profound weight. When they arrived at Earl's favorite park bench near the library, Malik helped his grandfather out of the car, steadying him carefully with a practiced hand. The mist hung low over the grass, curling around the benches and the lampposts, lending the scene a soft, cinematic haze. Children's laughter echoed in the distance, but Malik's focus remained narrow on the task at hand, ensuring his grandfather's safety and comfort. The duffel bag, still far away at the precinct, remained in his thoughts, a silent reminder of the morning's extraordinary test. For the rest of the afternoon, Malik and Earl moved through their small routines, the sorting of mail, the arranging of supplies, the subtle care of home that had become both ritual and responsibility. Yet, because beneath the ordinary motions, a quiet pulse of satisfaction ran through Malik, a deep-seated awareness that the right choice had been made. The act of honesty, performed alone in the rain, had not only tested his character, but had set the stage for consequences that neither he nor his grandfather could fully anticipate. As dusk settled over Eastwood Flats, the city lights flickered on, and the warm glow of apartment windows dotted the streets. Malik sat by the window, watching the faint haze of fog curling along the sidewalks and the distant glow of neon. The weight of the day's decisions had settled into a quiet satisfaction, a knowing that integrity, even unseen, carried its own power. He returned to the notebook, drawing lines that reflected plans for the coming week, small projects to maintain order and care within the apartment, and every stroke, every careful measurement, felt imbued with the significance of the morning's moral choice. Outside, the city moved on in its indifferent rhythm, but inside the small brownstone, the evening held a different kind of motion, a steady, deliberate heartbeat of responsibility, morality, and quiet pride. Malik leaned back, allowing himself a moment of reflection, the soft golden light casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Integrity had been tested, honesty upheld, and a ripple had begun, one that would reach far beyond the confines of the alley, the duffel, and the damp streets of Eastwood Flats. The next morning arrived heavy with mist and muted sunlight, drifting over Eastwood Flats like a gauzy veil. Malik awoke before his grandfather, as the familiar scrape of Earl Johnson's chair on the worn kitchen linoleum, signaling that the old man had begun his day. Malik swung his legs from beneath the thin blanket, wincing at the stiffness in his arms from the duffel he had carried the day before, but a steady determination propelled him forward. Breakfast was a quiet ritual. Earl sipped coffee, carefully guided by the scent and feel of the mug in his hands, while Malik arranged the pills for the morning and prepared a modest oatmeal breakfast, steam curling upward in delicate swirls, carrying the warmth and safety of their tiny apartment. After the morning routine, Malik set off toward the local corner store, the worn sneakers squelching against puddles, the notebook he had used for sketches clutched under one arm. He paused briefly in the alley behind the shop, and his eyes scanning the wet asphalt and brick walls as memories of the leather duffel and the stacks of cash came back to him. The encounter with Victoria Lane replayed vividly in his mind, the way she had scrutinized him, her presence at the precinct exuding authority and silent curiosity. Though he was only 9, Malik felt the subtle weight of expectation in her gaze, the unspoken acknowledgement that his choice had carried meaning beyond his small world. At the corner store, Malik exchanged the aluminum cans he had collected for a few dollars, every coin a small triumph over necessity. The neighborhood buzzed faintly around him, a child's laughter drifting from a nearby stoop, a neighbor sweeping debris from the cracked sidewalk, the distant hum of a bus idling at the stop. Life continued as usual for most, but Malik carried within him a quiet pride and a deep sense of responsibility that no one could see, a sense that the small acts of honesty and care had already begun to shape the trajectory of his life. By mid-morning, the sound of distant traffic blended with the soft coo of pigeons along the fire escapes. Malik approached the library, a modest brick building with faded murals along its walls, and slipped inside. Rows of books, their spines worn and titles curling, beckoned with promise. He had learned early that knowledge, like integrity, was a quiet power. Today, however, his focus was not on books alone. His thoughts drifted to the woman, Victoria, and the moral weight of the morning's events. The idea that someone so powerful had observed his act of honesty stirred a mix of hope and anxiety in him, but he wondered if she would truly understand, if she would see him as more than just a boy in soaked clothes with a heavy bag. Hours passed in measured routine. Malik returned home for lunch, the light through the small window casting long, soft shadows across the kitchen floor. Earl stirred the oatmeal, the familiar motions grounding Malik as he recounted the morning again, though in fragments, careful not to overstate anything. The old man listened, the pale blue of his eyes seeming to pierce the veil between action and consequence, gauging not just what Malik said, but the steadiness behind it. Malik felt, for the first time, a quiet understanding pass between them. The choice he had made mattered, even if the world had not yet taken notice. Later in the afternoon, a knock at the door drew Malik's attention. He opened it to find Mrs. Grayson, her umbrella still wet from the lingering drizzle. "I'm here to drive you and your grandfather somewhere," she said, voice calm, a gentle authority in her tone. Malik nodded, stepping aside to help guide Earl, whose cane tapped rhythmically against the stoop. The world outside remained misty and muted, the familiar streets stretching into soft blurs. The ride to the precinct was filled with quiet thought, Malik's small hands resting lightly on his grandfather's arm, a tether of reassurance. Each passing streetlight illuminated the fog in slices, turning the city into a cinematic landscape of gray and gold, reflections rippling through puddles on the asphalt. Upon arrival, the precinct came into view, a brick building, its facade dull but solid, a symbol of order in a world that often seemed indifferent. Malik's pulse quickened, yet the duffel still rested behind the counter, a tangible reminder of the responsibility he had assumed. Inside, officers moved about, engaged in routine tasks, but the memory of Victoria's presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of his consciousness. Malik's heart carried a mixture of nervous anticipation and the quiet assurance of integrity upheld. He had done what he knew was right. Now all that remained was the unfolding of consequences he could not yet see. As they stepped into the lobby, Malik felt the familiar hum of activity, the click of boots on linoleum, the low murmur of conversations, the distant ring of telephones. He guided Earl to a bench near the window, adjusting his grandfather's jacket against the lingering chill. The fog outside blurred the city into abstract shapes, but inside was the warmth of the precinct contrasted sharply with the damp, gray streets. Malik's gaze lingered on the counter, where the duffel rested securely, the contents hidden yet fully known to him. The sense of purpose that had propelled him through the morning remained, solid and unshakable, a quiet testament to the moral fiber instilled in him over years of care, observation, and the constant presence of a grandfather who had taught him the weight and value of every small choice. Even as the afternoon light waned, casting long shadows across the polished floor, Malik felt an internal calm settle over him. The challenges of the day, the rain, the heavy leather bag, the watchful eyes of adults, had been met and surpassed not through strength or cunning, but through a deliberate commitment to honesty. While the subtle satisfaction of knowing he had acted rightly filled him with a quiet energy, a sense that the small alleyways of Eastwood Flats, the precinct, and the city beyond were all connected by threads of choices that mattered. Somewhere, beyond the fog and the ordinary rhythm of life, those choices were beginning to ripple outward, touching people and circumstances in ways he could not yet imagine, setting the stage for what was to come. A few minutes later, the precinct door swung open again, and Malik's eyes caught the silhouette of a woman framed by the dull, wet light outside. She moved with a deliberate grace that seemed to command the air around her, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Victoria Lane, impeccably dressed in a tailored dark blazer and a single strand of pearls, stepped in, her expression carefully measured, yet carrying the subtle tension of someone whose afternoon had been unraveling with every unanswered call about the missing bag. Her assistant lingered a step behind, holding a neatly stacked folder and a tablet, his brow furrowed in quiet concern. Malik felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in his stomach, but did not avert his gaze. He had carried the duffel through rain, fog, and moral pressure. Facing her now felt like the final step in an unspoken test. Victoria paused near the counter, letting her eyes travel slowly over the duffel bag, the officers, and finally resting on Malik. She crouched slightly, not in performative warmth, but in the kind of genuine curiosity that weighed heavy with consideration. "You found this?" she asked, her voice steady, almost measured to mask the tension behind it. Malik nodded, keeping his small hands folded before him. "Yes, ma'am. I brought it here. I didn't take any of it." The words felt simple but carried the depth of the morning's decisions, and for a moment, the precinct seemed to shrink around the gravity of them. The officer at the counter, still observing, stepped back slightly, leaving a narrow space between Victoria and Malik. Harlan, the sergeant, straightened from his crouch, the faintest trace of surprise in his otherwise unreadable expression. He motioned toward the counted stacks of money on the counter, and Victoria's eyes flicked to the neat bundles, her face betraying just a hint of the rising tension in her chest. Each stack represented more than currency. It represented trust, responsibility, and the unknown future that lay in the hands of this small boy standing upright, was unwavering in the storm of adult expectation and authority. Victoria's voice softened, just slightly. "You didn't take any of it?" she asked again, as if the act of confirming honesty aloud could somehow anchor it in reality. Malik's gaze was steady, his posture resolute. "No, ma'am. It isn't mine. I wanted to make sure it got back to the right person." Her eyes lingered on him, scanning his soaked jacket, the faint streaks of mud on his sneakers, the careful way he held himself as if every step carried significance beyond mere movement. She could see it in him, the integrity, the discipline, the quiet moral compass that guided him when no one was watching. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of conversations in other rooms formed a background soundtrack to this quiet tableau. Aunt Victoria leaned back slightly, considering the magnitude of what had occurred. This was no ordinary child, no ordinary morning. Malik had navigated temptation, burden, and responsibility with a grace that belied his years. And she, a woman accustomed to commanding thousands of employees and managing millions in assets, felt the gravity of the simple yet profound choice he had made. She exhaled slowly, and for a moment, her carefully constructed composure faltered, just enough to reveal a flicker of something genuine beneath the polished exterior. "My bag," she said quietly, almost to herself, "has been missing for hours, and you brought it here, without hesitation." Malik simply nodded, his gaze unwavering, the faint blush from exertion on his cheeks accentuating the seriousness of his demeanor. She sensed the weight of his small, deliberate actions, the hours of thought, the physical effort, and the moral choice that had guided him from the alley behind Manny's diner to this very counter. Victoria glanced toward her assistant, who stood slightly behind, quietly observing, unsure how to intervene in a scene that felt far beyond the scope of ordinary protocol. She returned her attention to Malik, studying his face carefully, noting the clarity of his eyes, the set of his shoulders, and the quiet confidence that spoke louder than any words could convey. In that instant, she understood that this child's actions were not just an isolated incident of honesty. They were a declaration of character, a testament to the kind of person who acted rightly, without reward, without audience, without fanfare. Malik's chest rose and fell steadily, each breath measured, his mind replaying the morning's journey. The rain, the fog, the heavy leather of the duffel, the distant hum of the city, and now the soft, deliberate gaze of Victoria Lane. The precinct, with its fluorescent lights and polished linoleum, had transformed into a stage for a moral demonstration far greater than any test she could have imposed. For Malik, the weight of the duffel had lifted, replaced by the quiet knowledge that integrity, once exercised, reverberated beyond its immediate circumstances, touching those who recognized its value and resonating in ways neither he nor the world could fully anticipate. The moment stretched, delicate and tense, until Victoria finally straightened, her composure restored but softened by a subtle acknowledgement of the child before her. She spoke again, and her voice firm yet carrying an undercurrent of respect. "You did what was right. You didn't have to, and yet you did. That matters more than you realize." Malik felt a warmth rise in his chest, the affirmation gentle but profound. validating the long hours of care, responsibility, and quiet integrity he carried daily. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, the fog beginning to lift as sunlight broke through distant clouds. Inside, a small boy had proven that the courage to do right, even unseen, could shift the tides of consequence in ways far greater than the sum of its parts. Victoria Lane lingered for a moment, her gaze still fixed on Malik, as though trying to measure the depth of his honesty against the backdrop of her own carefully controlled world. The precinct buzzed around them, officers moving through their routines, phones ringing, printers whirring, yet all of it seemed to fade into background noise compared to the quiet gravity in the center of the room. She finally exhaled and straightened fully, a subtle shift in her posture betraying the first genuine trace of warmth she had allowed herself since the day had begun. I need to understand more, she said, voice lower now, more personal, as if addressing not only the child, but the principle he embodied. Malik, small yet steady, nodded once, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't need to say anything more. The weight of his choice spoke louder than words ever could. Sergeant Harlan, standing a few feet away, tilted his head slightly, observing the exchange. He had seen plenty in his years on the force, lost property, petty theft, all disputes over money, but rarely had he witnessed such a precise, unshakable demonstration of character from someone so young. The careful way Malik had carried the duffel, the measured honesty of his words, and the quiet integrity in his posture created a stark contrast to the rush and self-interest often exhibited by adults. Harlan's eyes met the officer at the counter. They shared a fleeting look, a silent acknowledgement that this child had done something extraordinary, something that went beyond the usual metrics of obedience or courage. Victoria stepped closer to the counter, lowering her voice just slightly. "Tell me again, how far did you carry it?" Malik straightened, recalling every step with vivid clarity. "About 1.5 miles, ma'am, from the alley behind Manny's diner. I had to stop a few times. It was heavy, but I kept going." His voice carried a calm precision, each word measured, his memory of the morning mapped like a trail he had walked countless times in his head. The officers around them listened in quiet fascination, their usual bustle stilled by the gravity of the scene. Even the mundane noises of the precinct, the clatter of keys, the hum of ventilation, seemed to retreat in deference to the lesson unfolding. Victoria's eyes softened, just a fraction, as she processed his answer. The calculated poise in her professional world rarely allowed for genuine surprise. Yet here it was, fleeting and undeniable, sparked by the unwavering steadiness of a boy who had acted correctly without expectation of reward or recognition. "And you didn't take anything?" she asked again, her voice carrying more warmth this time, but almost incredulous in its sincerity. Malik met her gaze directly, unwavering. "No, ma'am, it isn't mine. I just wanted to make sure it went back to whoever it belongs to." The simplicity of the answer belied the immense moral weight of the act, and for a brief moment, the room felt suspended in recognition of something larger than themselves, a single act of integrity echoing far beyond the confines of the precinct. The assistant, still standing behind Victoria, shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond. He had spent hours tracking the missing duffel, arranging schedules, confirming deliveries, and yet this small human presence, wet, shivering, yet unflinching, had altered the dynamics of the day. Victoria glanced at him briefly, then back at Malik, her mind running through the implications: honesty, accountability, courage, and an innate moral compass that not even adulthood or authority could manufacture. In the glow of the fluorescent lights, the leather duffel lay between them, stacks of cash contained, orderly and entirely secondary to the demonstration of character unfolding above it. Malik's chest rose and fell steadily as he waited, the residual tension of the morning dissipating into a calm he had not felt until now. He thought of his grandfather, Earl, waiting at home with the small rituals of breakfast, pills, and the faint smell of coffee, and of the routine care that had taught him discipline, observation, and quiet judgment. The moral muscle he had developed through those daily, often unseen duties had carried him through the rain, the alley, and now into the presence of someone whose life operated on the scale of millions of dollars, yet had been caught off guard by the clarity and purity of a child's conscience. Victoria finally leaned forward slightly, resting her hands lightly on the edge of the counter, her eyes scanning the boy's face for the subtlest signs of hesitation or doubt. None existed. "You've done something rare," she said softly, her voice losing the steel edge she usually carried into boardrooms and meetings. "Something important. And I want you to know that it hasn't gone unnoticed." Malik's lips parted in a faint, careful smile. The acknowledgement didn't come with fanfare or reward, yet it resonated more profoundly than anything tangible could provide. He had acted rightly, and someone whose world encompassed vast wealth and power had recognized it in a moment of authenticity. The sergeant cleared his throat, on a faint smile tugging at his features, and the officer at the counter returned to filing papers. Yet neither disrupted the quiet gravity of the moment. Malik, small and drenched from the morning's rain, stood firm, a figure of integrity that had risen above circumstance and temptation. The precinct felt larger, the space between people charged not with routine or duty, but with an unspoken reverence for the act they had witnessed. Each of them, in their own way, understood that the consequence of a single, untainted choice could ripple far beyond the immediate scene, touching lives and redefining expectations. Victoria exhaled again, slower this time, letting her posture relax as she straightened fully. She looked down at the duffel, then back at Malik, and for a fleeting second, the controlled, professional mask that always guarded her expression slipped, revealing a human response: awe, admiration, and a subtle warmth that reached across the gulf between her world and his. "You've reminded me," she said quietly, "that honesty isn't measured by circumstance. It's measured by what you do when nobody is watching. And today, you've shown me what that truly looks like." Malik felt a subtle warmth flood through his chest, a quiet satisfaction that transcended relief or pride. It was the confirmation that the morning's choice, though small in the context of the sprawling city, mattered, touched someone, altered perception, and perhaps in ways he could not yet see, would lead to something greater. The fog outside began to thin, sunlight breaking through distant clouds, while casting slats of light across the linoleum and illuminating the edges of the duffel's leather, the stacks of cash, and the child who had carried them with integrity. The precinct had returned to its rhythm, but the echo of that small, deliberate act resonated, stretching far beyond the walls, into streets, homes, and hearts that would be quietly transformed by the courage of a 9-year-old boy. The drive home was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the tires on wet asphalt and the occasional sigh of Earl's cane tapping lightly against the floorboard. Malik sat in the passenger seat, his small hands resting lightly in his lap, the edges of his notebook poking out from under his arm. The city had begun to shed its mist, and pale sunlight filtered through the streaked windshield, painting muted gold patterns across the dashboard. Just Malik's mind wandered back to the precinct, to the subtle shift in Victoria Lane's expression, the way her eyes had softened, and the faint, unspoken acknowledgement that his actions mattered more than he could yet comprehend. The thought made his chest swell, not with pride alone, but with a deep, quiet satisfaction that integrity could ripple across worlds in ways he had never imagined. Earl's voice broke the reverie. "Son, that woman, Did she seem impressed? The question was soft, but it carried the weight of years and experience, a curiosity sharpened by both blindness and the acute awareness that nothing in life came without observation. Malik nodded slowly, recounting the exchange as best he could, careful to remain precise with his words. Yes, sir. She understood, I think. She noticed. Earl's hands flexed around his mug, and a faint smile brushed across his pale, weathered face. Good, he said simply, his voice firm yet tinged with warmth. That's all that matters, the choice itself. You did right. Back in their apartment on Deacon Street, the golden glow of late afternoon light softened the edges of the small, well-worn kitchen. Every jar and container bore tactile labels for Earl's fingertips, a quiet testament to decades of adapting to limitations while preserving dignity. Malik moved efficiently, laying out the evening's small meal, while keeping one ear attuned to the low murmur of his grandfather's commentary on local news from the radio. Each task was methodical, a practiced choreography that had taken years to perfect. Yet today, there was a subtle ease to his motions, almost as though the moral affirmation from the morning's events had lightened the invisible weight he carried. As the sun began to sink lower, casting long, soft shadows across the floorboards, a knock came at the door. Malik's heart quickened slightly, though not from fear. It was the rhythm of anticipation, a quiet tension that accompanied the unknown. Opening the door, he found Mrs. Grayson, the neighbor who often helped with small errands, standing there with a gentle smile. She held an umbrella, droplets of rain still clinging to its ribs, and a folded tote bag in her hands. I thought I'd drive you and your grandfather a bit, she said. Malik nodded, stepping aside to help guide Earl to the door. The weight of responsibility was familiar, grounding him in the world he navigated daily. But the events of the morning added a new dimension, a sense that right choices had resonance beyond their immediate consequences. The drive through Eastwood Flats was quiet, punctuated only by the soft hum of the car engine and the occasional creak of tires rolling over uneven pavement. The streets, still damp from the earlier rain, glistened in the late sunlight. Malik watched familiar storefronts pass by. The corner bodega, the barber shop with its peeling paint, the library with its faded murals. Each detail grounded him, yet the significance of the morning's moral choice lingered in his mind, coloring the ordinary with a subtle gravity. It was a lesson in integrity, enacted quietly but observed, understood, and validated by someone from a world far removed from the narrow streets he called home. On arriving at the precinct once more to check on the bag's status was not necessary, yet Malik's thoughts drifted back there, imagining the careful counting of the bundles, the officer's muted awe, and Victoria Lane's lingering gaze. He imagined the ripple that would unfold, the consequences invisible to him, yet inexorably set in motion by a small boy's quiet courage. The afternoon sun now lit the apartment in warm, muted hues as they returned, bathing the familiar kitchen in soft gold. Malik helped Earl inside, guiding him carefully past the doorframe, around the low table, and into the chair by the window, where the elderly man's fingers flexed slowly around the mug of warm tea. The apartment, with its gentle hum of normalcy, seemed alive with a quiet energy, which infused with the resonance of integrity recognized and the faint anticipation of what might follow. Evening settled fully over Eastwood Flats, stretching long shadows across the brick facades and cracked sidewalks. Malik sat at the small kitchen table, notebook open, sketching quietly as Earl sipped his tea. Outside, the muted sounds of city life carried, the soft bark of a distant dog, the distant wail of a siren, the hum of tires on wet asphalt. Inside, however, there was a stillness that pulsed with significance. Malik reflected on the morning's choice, the duffel, the woman's gaze, and the knowledge that his actions, small yet deliberate, had begun to bridge the vast divide between his modest world and a realm of authority and wealth he had never before touched. The golden glow of the lamps accentuated the lines of concentration on Malik's face. The careful way his pencil moved across the paper, each stroke deliberate, precise, and meaningful. He outlined plans for organizing chores, refining household routines, and even small ideas for helping neighbors, each marked by meticulous measurements and notes. Though these were modest endeavors in the grand scheme of the city, they were imbued with the same integrity and attention to detail that had carried the duffel from the alley to the precinct. The moral foundation established in that morning act began to permeate his small world, shaping his approach to responsibility, observation, and care. Night fell, and the apartment softened under the warm glow of interior lights. Malik placed his notebook aside, careful to align its edges with the table, and then helped Earl to a blanket draped over the back of his chair. The soft patter of late rain against the window combined with the gentle creak of the building settling around them, creating a comforting, cinematic soundscape that wrapped the room in quiet reflection. Malik watched his grandfather, observing the subtle details of posture, the faint, practiced motions of hands and fingers, and felt a renewed sense of purpose, pride, and anticipation. The day had begun as ordinary, but the quiet act of integrity and its recognition had shifted the tone of everything. The ripple had begun, and Malik knew that tomorrow, and the days to follow, held the potential to expand that quiet transformation into something far-reaching, touching lives beyond his immediate world. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and a crisp spring light spilling over Eastwood Flats, washing the narrow streets in pale gold. Malik awoke early, as usual, before his grandfather stirred. He lay for a moment beneath the thin blanket, listening for the familiar scrape of Earl's chair against the linoleum, a subtle rhythm that marked the start of each day. When the sound came, steady and familiar, Malik exhaled softly and swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the stiffness in his arms from the duffel yesterday still lingering, but tempered by the quiet pride that had grown in its place. Today felt different. The city outside, the dampness in the morning air, the hum of distant traffic, all of it seemed to reflect the shift in his small world. He dressed quickly, pulling on the worn sweatshirt that had seen countless mornings and the threadbare sneakers that had carried him through puddles and snow alike. The smell of Earl's coffee greeted him even before he reached the kitchen, where the old man sat in his usual chair, fingers wrapped around the mug with practiced precision. "Morning, Malik," Earl said, voice calm, tone measured. "Didn't hear you get up." Malik smiled faintly, setting the small dish of morning pills on the counter and arranging a simple bowl of oatmeal, steam curling up in delicate swirls that carried warmth and reassurance across the room. "Morning, Grandpa. I got breakfast ready," he said, careful in each movement, precise, deliberate, the ritual of care already woven into his being from years of responsibility beyond his age. As they ate, Malik recounted fragments of the morning at the precinct, carefully omitting no detail of what had transpired with Victoria Lane and the duffel. Earl listened, pale blue eyes clouded but attentive, tracking the weight behind Malik's words rather than the words themselves. "Good work, son," Earl said, a faint edge of pride breaking through his normally steady voice. "You did right. That matters more than you know." Malik's chest swelled with the subtle warmth of recognition, though he did not lean back or bask in it. The affirmation was quiet, personal, and it settled deep within him, reinforcing the lessons of the past, the small, deliberate choices that shaped integrity in ways grander than applause or acknowledgement ever could. After breakfast, Malik moved with practiced precision, organizing the kitchen, checking the mail, and preparing the small pile of cans he had collected from nearby streets. Each movement was deliberate, each action methodical. A choreography of care and responsibility honed through years of guiding his grandfather and maintaining their modest household. Outside, the streets glimmered under the fresh morning sun, and children played along the sidewalks and in the narrow parkways, their laughter echoing faintly, oblivious to the layers of moral complexity unfolding in the lives of those they passed. Malik paused at the edge of the park, notebook tucked under one arm, his fingers tracing the leather straps of his backpack. He thought again of Victoria Lane and the subtle weight of her gaze, the acknowledgement of his integrity. It was a concept nearly as heavy as the duffel had been, though unseen and unmeasured. Her recognition of what he had done, and the ripple it might create, added a new dimension to the familiar streets and alleys of Eastwood Flats. Each detail of the neighborhood, the cracked fire escapes, the peeling paint of the corner bodega, the faint hum of distant traffic, seemed to hold a kind of suspended significance, reflecting the quiet power of moral choice in a world that rarely paused to notice. By mid-morning, Malik returned home, carrying the small pile of recyclables and arranging them carefully in the corner of the kitchen, next to the notebook where he had sketched organizational ideas. The sun through the window created a soft halo around him, highlighting the careful alignment of jars and dishes, the labels designed for Earl's touch. Every motion was imbued with a sense of purpose, and a reflection of the moral foundation strengthened yesterday. The understanding that integrity, once exercised, shaped not only immediate actions but the environment and people around him. As lunch approached, the warmth of the kitchen and the familiar smells of cooking lent a cinematic intimacy to the apartment. Malik prepared the modest meal for his grandfather, arranging the plates and utensils with meticulous care, then seated Earl comfortably, adjusting the chair and blankets as needed. The routine, while ordinary on the surface, had taken on a subtle grandeur. Each movement resonated with the significance of yesterday's events, underscoring the quiet authority of conscientious action. Earl watched him with a mixture of calm observation and gentle admiration, the faintest curve of a smile brushing across his face. In the afternoon, a soft knock at the door brought Malik to a halt. Mrs. Grayson, the neighbor who often assisted with small errands, stood outside, umbrella in hand, water dripping from its edges. "I thought I'd come by and give you both a ride," she said, her voice calm yet carrying a subtle undertone of respect. Malik nodded, guiding his grandfather carefully out the door. The streets of Eastwood Flats stretched before them, bathed in pale, flickering sunlight, glistening puddles reflecting muted neon signs and the hazy outlines of buildings. Every step was deliberate, measured, echoing the care he had demonstrated throughout the morning, the careful consideration of each choice carrying him forward. During the ride, Malik observed the familiar cityscape, the brick facades of shops, the narrow alleyways, with the faint glint of sunlight on damp asphalt, and allowed his mind to wander. Thoughts of Victoria Lane, the moral gravity of the morning, and the faint, unspoken acknowledgement she had given him threaded through his consciousness, intertwining with memories of his grandfather's guidance. The hum of the car and the occasional splash of passing vehicles provided a cinematic backdrop to the quiet, deliberate reflection of a boy whose choices had already begun to extend beyond his immediate surroundings. Arriving at the park near the library, Malik helped Earl out of the car, steadying him with practiced hands. The fog, still lingering in wisps along the sidewalks, lent the scene a cinematic softness, while children played in the distance, their energy unthinking, unaware of the gravity of the morning's events. Malik led his grandfather to the bench, ensuring he was comfortable and secure, the edges of the day already infused with a quiet triumph, a subtle ripple that had begun to shape both their lives and the unseen currents of the city beyond. As evening approached, the small apartment glowed under the golden warmth of lamps. Malik returned to his sketches, refining plans, outlining chores, and imagining small ways to help neighbors, each line precise, deliberate, and imbued with meaning. Outside, Eastwood Flats moved through its ordinary rhythm, but inside, a quiet revolution of character, integrity, and responsibility unfolded. Carried forward by a 9-year-old boy whose choices had begun to reverberate far beyond the walls of their apartment and into the hearts and minds of those who witnessed, even fleetingly, the courage of doing what was right. The following morning, Malik awoke to a pale light filtering through the thin curtains, the streets of Eastwood Flats still glistening from an early dew that made every asphalt crack and rusted grate shimmer. He rose carefully, aware of the slight stiffness in his shoulders from yesterday's exertion, yet buoyed by a quiet energy born from the affirmation of doing what was right. Earl's soft shuffling from the kitchen signaled the start of their day, and Malik moved to prepare breakfast, arranging the oatmeal, fruit, and medications with the practiced precision that had become second nature. Each motion was deliberate, not rushed, a choreography shaped by years of care and responsibility that few could truly understand. The apartment, small and lived in, smelled of coffee and toast, and sunlight pooled in soft rectangles on the worn linoleum floor. Malik's eyes lingered on the stacks of labeled jars and the carefully arranged dishes, the tactile labels Earl relied on for independence, and he felt the weight of continuity, the knowledge that every small act of order preserved dignity and comfort for his grandfather. Today, though, a subtle anticipation underscored every gesture. The morning's encounter with Victoria Lane lingered in his mind, the way her eyes had softened, the unspoken acknowledgement that the duffel, the rain, and his choices had mattered in a realm far larger than his neighborhood. After breakfast, Malik set about his usual errands, collecting cans, checking the mailbox, and running small, purposeful errands for neighbors who trusted him in ways the broader city did not recognize. On each step through the streets, puddles reflecting muted sunlight reminded him of the duality of his world, ordinary routines layered atop extraordinary moral decisions. The distant hum of traffic, the faint laughter of children in the alleys, the fluttering of laundry on a line, all of it framed a cinematic backdrop to the subtle triumph he carried with him, the quiet integrity that gave his day rhythm and weight. By mid-morning, he had returned home, placing the collected cans neatly in the corner, alongside his sketchbook and notebooks filled with meticulous plans for organizing household routines and small acts of kindness he could offer neighbors. Each line he drew, each note he made, carried significance far beyond the page. It reflected the discipline, observation, and moral clarity nurtured through years of quiet responsibility. Yet the leather duffel and the bundles of cash, though physically absent, remained vivid in his mind, emblematic of the courage required to act rightly when no one was watching. Earl settled into his chair with his morning tea, the familiar steam curling up toward the ceiling. Malik helped him adjust the blanket across his knees, ensuring his comfort, and then sat at the small kitchen table, observing the old man's subtle movements, the flex of fingers around the mug, the gentle tilt of the head toward the window. The room, bathed in soft morning light, was alive with quiet purpose, every element, a chair, a cup, a carefully labeled jar, serving as a reminder of the continuity, dignity, and responsibility that defined their lives. A knock at the door interrupted the morning stillness. Malik opened it to find Mrs. Grayson, her umbrella dripping with dew, offering her usual calm smile. "I thought I'd help with a ride for today," she said, her voice steady yet imbued with warmth. Malik nodded and guided Earl to the door, steadying him with the practiced touch of someone who had spent countless mornings ensuring his grandfather's safety and comfort. The streets beyond shimmered in muted sunlight, puddles reflecting the brick facades of familiar buildings, and the hum of the city seemed to blend into a gentle rhythm that mirrored Malik's own careful steps. During the ride, Malik's thoughts again returned to Victoria Lane and the subtle, potent acknowledgement of his integrity. He considered the ripple effects of the morning's events, imagining the consequences that might unfold in ways he could not yet perceive. The streets of Eastwood Flats, while glistening under a pale sun and lined with familiar stoops and fire escapes, formed a cinematic corridor, each familiar landmark echoing the quiet triumphs of a boy whose moral courage had begun to reshape the perception of those around him. They arrived at the precinct to confirm the duffel was safe, though the physical presence of the bag was secondary now to the moral weight it symbolized. Malik helped guide Earl to a bench, ensuring comfort and stability, as he had done countless times before. The fog of the early morning had lifted, but a lingering sense of anticipation remained, as though the city itself had paused to observe the consequences of integrity. The officers moved about with their usual rhythm, yet the room felt charged, the morning's quiet demonstration of honesty casting a subtle but undeniable gravity over the proceedings. As the day waned into afternoon, the pair returned home, the apartment bathed in soft, golden light. Malik set about refining sketches and notes, outlining plans for chores, household management, and community acts of service. Each stroke was deliberate, infused with the same attention and moral awareness that had guided him through the morning's extraordinary challenges. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the subtle transformation occurring in the small apartment on Deacon Street, where a boy's quiet courage was already beginning to ripple outward, shaping character, actions, and perhaps, in ways yet unseen, the future itself. Evening fell over Eastwood Flats, soft shadows pooling across the worn streets and alleys, while the apartment glowed warmly, a haven of order, responsibility, and quiet triumph. Malik placed his notebook aside, aligned it carefully on the table, and adjusted his grandfather's blanket over his shoulders. The air was calm, punctuated by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the faint tap of rain against the window. Malik watched Earl, noting the slight movements of fingers and shoulders, and felt a quiet satisfaction that went beyond pride or relief. The satisfaction that comes from understanding that the right choice had been made, and that its effects, like ripples on water, had only just begun. If this story touched your heart, drop a 0 in the comments to let us know you believe in the power of doing right. Now don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next story that will lift your spirits and remind you how one small act can change everything.